So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to do an increase stitch. And an increase stitch is simply 2 stitches in the same stitch of the previous round. And that differs from, for example, a single crochet stitch, because for a single crochet stitch, you only put 1 stitch in a stitch of the previous round. Normally when people say increase stitch, it also refers to a single crochet increase stitch. And that really tells you what type of stitch to put twice in one stitch. There are such things as like double crochet increases and whatnot, but patterns will usually explicitly point that out if they want you to do that instead. So to get your eye trained, let's first look at how an increase stitch looks different from a single crochet stitch when you're done with it. So here we have a single crochet stitch. And I can tell because I can see that there's only 1 stitch in this hole over here. These 2 vertical lines represent where the stitch grabbed onto the previous round. So if I go 1 stitch back, I can see that there's actually 2 stitches in here. There's actually 2 V's next to each other, going into 1 hole. See over here? That's the increase stitch. And from this angle, you can see those 2 horizontal V's representing 2 stitches. All right, so we've got the single crochet stitch here. I'm gonna do an increase stitch in this next stitch. So to do that, get into position. I'm going to do a single crochet stitch as I normally would. So put the hook through both top loops, yarn over. Remember, the yarn needs to go over the top of the hook. Pull it through. Now you have 2 loops on your hook. Yarn over, pull it through again. And remember, an increase stitch is simply 2 of these in the same stitch. So you're going to do exactly the same motions. The question is only, where do you put the hook? So for the stitch I just made, I just put it in this stitch. And I can tell that for a number of reasons. One, again, following this piece of yarn and where it hooked under, I can see that it's hooked under into this hole. And also, when you're working with different types of yarn, it could be harder to see. So something I used to do in the beginning was literally pull on the stitch that I just made to see where in the piece it was attached to. And so you can see it's moving this hole. So that hole is the one where you just put your hook into. So that's going to be the same hole that you put your hook into now to do the second stitch of the increase stitch. And there you have it. So in amigurumi, there is the concept of an invisible increase stitch, because you want the outside of your work to always look really smooth and not have these holes. As you can see, putting your hook repetitively into the same exact hole might create a gap in your final product like this. So the only difference between an invisible increase stitch and a regular one is where you put your hook into that very first time. So if you want to do an invisible increase stitch, you put your hook under only the front loop of the next stitch for that very first half of the increase stitch. Then for the second half, you put your hook under both top loops and do your single crochet stitch. And see how the gap that's created by these 2 stitches is a much smaller than the gap created by the previous 2 stitches, which was the regular increase stitch. All right, so I'm going to quiz you now. We just completed 2 increase stitches, and let's say I say we want to make another increase stitch. Where would you put the hook? Yep, it's over here. So let's just do a regular increase stitch again. I've done the first single crochet, and let's quiz you again. Where would you put your hook in to make the second half of this increased stitch. Yep, over here. And let's take a look back on all the work we just did to confirm that we indeed have made increased stitches. You can see that there's 2 V's, vertical V's, going under this stitch. You can confirm this by pulling on them to see where they're latched onto. So that's one increased stitch. And then we've got another 2 in this hole. That's a second increased stitch. And then we've got another 2 in this hole. That's a third increased stitch. And then this one's different. This is a single crochet stitch. There's only 1 V in this hole. And this is the stitch I was showing you in the very beginning. So the other thing I want to mention is, let's say you were crocheting with a stitch marker and you knew that this round needed to be a bunch of increased stitches. Even though there's 3 increased stitches in here, the way you count the number of stitches in a round is by saying that right now there's actually 6 stitches in this round, assuming that the stitch marker marks the first stitch of every round. And again, that goes back to the fact that an increased stitch equals 2 stitches in 1 stitch of the previous round. So you would count it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches so far in this round.